She could hear the birds chirping. It was morning, but she did not want to open her eyes. She had cried herself to sleep the night before, and she could feel her puffy eyes a bit stuck together. Where am I? She asked herself. And then it all came rushing back to her again. Her stomach squirmed as if somebody had punched her. She was no longer a mother anymore, not since yesterday. She felt nauseous. She lay very still. The tears were already beginning to build up in the corners of her puffy eyes. And a strange feeling enveloped her. It was so intense. What was this feeling? Yes, it was loneliness, intense loneliness. It was as if she was on an island in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and everyone had left. The last 2 boats carrying her son and her husband had sailed away, and she was all alone. Her kind neighbors were already up, and they came into the room, and they gently helped her get dressed. She barely had the energy to lift her arms up. She had a sense of déjà vu. She recalled this heaviness when her husband had died. There was a similar sense of darkness and gloom, but then it was slightly different, because then there had been a very thin glimmer of hope. The one she would live for, the one who she would sacrifice everything for. Her hope was her son. He would be the one who would be able to lift them up from the bottom. In her society, it would be up to him to support her in the future. Because of him, she knew that eventually she would smile again. He would marry a loving girl from the village, and they would have children which she would help to raise. She would have something to live for again. But now she heard the whispers of her neighbors. She must be cursed with her husband and son both dead now. Poor thing, cursed at such a young age. With nobody to support her as a woman, she would now have to find the means to support herself somehow. We don't know the age of the widow in our story, but without a male member of the household to support her, she would be destined to live off the mercy of others. Perhaps eventually begging at the temple at best. In another story of widows in the Bible, in the Old Testament, probably the only 2 widows I know the name of, Naomi and Ruth, the only way they could gather food would be to glean grain. And to glean means to gather bit by bit. When you gleaned a field, you would follow the grain cutters who were gathering the seed kernels, and then you would go after the seed kernels that they missed. And for the very poor, this was often the only way they would get food, leftover grains. When you were a widow in that society, in that time, you were the poorest of the poor, and you had to count on the generosity of others. In that society, your position could not be elevated on your own as a woman. In fact, any land that belonged to your husband would be passed on to the nearest male relative. Everybody knew this. Our widow of Nain headed out of the gates with the funeral procession. Has anyone been part of a funeral procession? I remember Princess Diana's funeral procession many years ago. I remember watching it on TV. It was very quiet, but interspersed in the somber procession, there were people who were crying and sobbing as her coffin passed them. When I lived in Singapore as a child, I attended a number of Buddhist funerals with my parents, and I would see the grieving family crying quietly, but next to them, there would be a group of people screaming and wailing. They would be dressed in black and be clutching at each other in desperation. I'd never seen people so upset at the death of someone. And then my dad told me that they were professional mourners. People actually get paid to cry and wail. This has been a tradition for many cultures around the world. And I imagine plenty of crying and wailing during this young man's funeral procession. According to the tradition around Jesus' time, if you met a funeral procession on your journey, instead of stepping to one side and letting them pass, as we do here in Western culture and tradition, here you would act, in those times, you would actually be obliged to join them and continue with them towards the burial grounds. And when I was looking up the location of Nain and information about it, I discovered that according to archaeologists, the burial site is about 10 miles from the mountain village of Nain, which would feel extra long if you were obliged to join a procession. Regarding Nain itself, did you know that Nain means lovely green pastures? Apparently, it commanded a beautiful, extensive view across the plain to Carmel over the Nazareth hills. Our widow would not have noticed these views on this particular day, the day she was about to bury her son. She would have been walking, looking down, deep in her grief, and not noticing another procession coming towards her. In this other procession, spirits would have been high. This group of people were following a new rabbi, one who, according to rumors, had just healed a Roman centurion servant. There was a certain buzz around this teacher. No one knew why Jesus had taken this particular route. The procession walking towards Nain would realize that they were approaching a funeral and that they would be obliged to join that procession. And when the two processions met, it says in Luke 7, verse 13, in the Passion Translation, which Mina and Eva read, when the Lord saw the grieving mother, his heart broke for her. With great tenderness, he said to her, "Please don't cry." I have no idea how Jesus' voice sounds, but I believe there would have been something in his voice which would have made our widow look up. His words would have startled her. And for a man held in high esteem, already considered to be a rabbi, a teacher, this is actually a very big deal. In Jewish society at the time, which was very patriarchal, men did not greet women in public. When you read the Gospels, Jesus did not overlook women or treat them with inferiority. He spoke to them with dignity and compassion. In fact, women in these times were excluded from even reading sacred texts. Men were required to read scriptures daily, while women were not allowed to read them. Jesus, on the other hand, encouraged women to become his disciples and entrusted them to spread the gospel. For example, the Samaritan woman that he met at the well, in John 4:39, it says, "Many of the Samaritans of that town began to believe in him because of the word of the woman who testified on his behalf." Jesus came to earth as a human being and treated all human beings with respect and dignity, recognizing what men and women had to offer. At this moment in time, when many female theology students, women studying to be pastors might be feeling discouraged, I want to reiterate that Jesus highly valued women and chose them to bear witness for him. To women pastors out there, do not be discouraged. We will continue to support you, and I want to take this opportunity to call on male leaders, lecturers, and colleagues, and which has been done so in Newbold especially. Continue to affirm the calling of the committed women out there. Let us as a church accept the gifts both men and women have to offer in our church and our community. Back to our widow. Imagine our widow looking up to see Jesus. She sees the man who has just spoken to her step towards the bier containing her son. She takes a sharp breath in. To touch a dead body was considered unclean. According to Numbers 19, verse 11, whoever touches a human corpse will be unclean for 7 days. She doesn't notice the crowd around them watching it intently. The pallbearers had been standing still since the man spoke. And she hears the man say, Young man, I say to you, arise and live. She wraps her arms around her as she sees her son who had been dead, not moving just moments earlier, sitting up, and she can't quite hear what he's saying, but his mouth is moving. And this man, who is this man? He comes towards her and presents her son to her. And she remembers the day when he was born, and her son was presented to her as a baby. And she breaks down crying with unexplained joy. The crowd around her shudders at what they've just seen. They say, actually, according to verse 16, they shout, God himself has visited us to bless his people. A great prophet has appeared among us. She doesn't know it, but this is the first time that Jesus has raised anyone from the dead. He goes on later to resurrect Jairus' daughter and his friend Lazarus. Each time, his heart is moved by compassion that compels him to act and heal the situation. For some reason, when I was asked to preach for the 1st of December, I immediately thought I was going to preach about something Christmassy. It would be about Jesus coming to this earth as a baby. It would be cozy. It would feel very cozy as we would remember the Christmas story of the baby Jesus in the manger and how God sent his only begotten Son into the world so that whosoever believes in him will not die but have everlasting life. And so I apologize that I couldn't make it any cozier. The story that I presented to you this morning is about the worst bits of living on this earth: death, helplessness, hopelessness, abandonment, despair, disappointment. The story of the widow and her son seems completely over when they meet Jesus. And yet, this story has the perfect twist. Have you ever had moments in your life when you thought that it was all over, and then something happened out of the blue? Something, you could even call it miraculous, happened, and when you look back at the whole experience, it feels completely different because you've already experienced the miracle, the something amazing. This happened to the widow of Nain. I believe that she had reached the lowest point in her life. All her praying would have been done before her son died. I can't imagine her praying for anything at this stage. Luke doesn't say much about her faith at all. All her options at this point would have been exhausted. The only thing she had left to do would be to bury her son and wait to die herself. Then Jesus, in his own timing, arrives, and everything changes. Have you ever been at that point yourself? You've tried everything and nothing happened. This is why Jesus came. Our God, the God of everything, the universe, and beyond, chose to come to this earth in the most vulnerable form, human form, and grew up to be a man who knew what living on this earth was truly like, and then showed us what God's kingdom was all about. And with what's left of this morning, we've just gone into afternoon rather, I want us to remind ourselves why Jesus came. He didn't come for everyone else except for us. He didn't come for the person sitting next to you. He came for you and me. This is what love required of him. Today, I want to bring to your attention how our story today gives us 3 reasons why Jesus chose to come to this world. Number 1, Jesus came because we matter. What I love about the story about the widow and almost everyone Jesus reaches out to in the book of Luke, everyone he reaches out to is on the fringes of society. As I mentioned to you before, the widow didn't ask Jesus to come. He came anyway. He met her where she was in his own timing. I don't know what's happening in your life right now, but today I wanted to tell you that Jesus will meet you wherever you are. You might not even be looking for him, but he will meet you. Pastor Patrick Johnson, a few weeks ago, in the service in contemporary service in Salisbury Hall, conveyed this same message, that God will meet you wherever you are. You might not think that you are worthy and you've lost all hope. You might not even be aware that he cares. He does. He will and can show up. Please check his sermon online about this. It's better than me telling you what he said. It's so amazing. But for me, this story affirms that thought to me. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. I know from all the other stories, including this story in the book of Luke, that Jesus does not turn away any moment to show people that they matter. The widow did not ask for help, but he knew what was required. And so he raised her son and changed their immediate future for the better. In the book Steps to Christ, written by Ellen G. White, she says that God gave him, Jesus, not only to live among men, to bear their sins and die their sacrifice. He gave him to the fallen race. Christ was to identify himself with the interests and needs of humanity. Jesus took on the struggles and challenges of humanity. He understands the grief that we bear. God made a promise to us from way back in the book of Genesis and has never given up on us since then. I came to Newbold many years ago when I was 11 years old. And this year, I'll be reaching my peak age of 45. I know. It's going to be downhill. No, just kidding. It's always the best is yet to come. But over the last 8 years, I have had the privilege of leading the Newbold Sisterhood, and I've gotten to know many wonderful women in this church. Most of the time, I can safely say that we have bonded or come closer together because of the various struggles that we have been through. I've also had the opportunity to hear stories of what many of you have endured. I know women who felt as if they don't matter. They go through the motions of living their lives, but they truly don't know if they matter. And I know many men too, who feel the same. One of the questions I have asked women in the sisterhood is, do you think you're saved? And honestly, I'm surprised by the many people who have told me that they're not sure. And I just want to shake them and say, look, see what God has done. Jesus has already come. He has fulfilled his promise, and all we have to do is to live as if death has already been conquered, because it truly has. In Romans 10, verse 9, says, if you declare with your mouth, Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. This is why Jesus came. This is why God in human form came to this earth. You matter. He meets you at your worst point, unafraid to be close to you, unafraid to touch the gritty mess that's inside of us. He comes close enough for others to even consider him unclean. Which brings me to my second point. Jesus came to show us that death has been conquered. I love the many ways in the English language you can say one thing, conquered. So you can say Jesus came to show us that death was vanquished, defeated, conquered. We can live without that burden of eternal condemnation. In verse 14, Jesus tells the man to rise up and live. What do you do when you've been given a second chance at life? How do you think the young man who was raised lived his life afterwards? Of course, we will never know on this side of heaven. But here's what I like to think. I like to think that the first gulp of air that he took in smelt so sweet to him. The first face he saw was Jesus' kind face. The first view that he had was from the top of the hills overlooking the beautiful plains mentioned earlier. Because he was so sick before he died, he must have had that feeling of, when you just feel so super well and healthy and you can run a marathon. I've never had that feeling yet. A few years ago, my sister had a brush with death after her diagnosis of breast cancer. Within a space of 3 weeks, she went from diagnosis to the operating table. She has been cancer-free since April 2016, but she sees life differently now. When something is almost taken away from you, you treasure it even more now, don't you? On the flip side, with me as her sister, I treasure every single second I'm with her. According to Terry A. Smith, the author of The Hospitable Leader, a miracle was not an extraordinary sign, not of the unusual things God can do, but of how God always wants things to be in this natural world. Jesus raising the dead was a sign that in his kingdom, death does not exist. In God's kingdom, how should each of us live our lives? Instead of feeling hopeless, let's live with hope and be encouraged. Instead of feeling abandoned, let's live to reach out and make connections. Instead of feeling helpless and abandoned, let's live with the knowledge that you are loved. Instead of feeling disappointment and despair, live courageously. Some of you have suffered abuse or trauma in your life. This isn't about me telling you that it's easy to suddenly change how you choose to live. I want to encourage you to understand that you don't have to stay stuck. You can reach out to get the necessary help, whether it be counseling, psychotherapy, whatever it is, to help you live the best life. Everybody, including those who have experienced some kind of trauma in their life, deserves to get the attention and care they need to heal from it. Jesus came because you matter and for you to live in freedom and abundance, which brings me to my final point, number 3. Jesus came because he wanted to show us what living in heaven's domain, in heaven's realm, is truly like. Jesus came to show us what living in God's kingdom is like. In verse 16, it says, "A tremendous sense of holy mystery swept over the crowd as they witnessed this miracle of resurrection. They shouted praises to God, saying, 'God himself has visited us to bless his people. A great prophet has appeared among us.'" Here we can see that the crowd, from their knowledge of the miracles of the prophets of Elijah, who was moved to compassion by the widow of Zarephath, and Elisha, who raised the son of the Shunammite woman, have immediately placed Jesus on the same level as the great prophets, and even higher, having witnessed the resurrection of this young man right in front of their eyes. My son Reuben and we used to like watching a magician, an illusionist, on TV called Dynamo. He would be walking down the street doing some inexplicable magic tricks on people, and inevitably a crowd of people would gather around him. And then when he did something they could not understand, everyone would jump back. They would go, "Whoa!" shake their heads. And I imagine the crowd all doing the same thing and whispering to each other, shaking their heads, and not quite understanding how this funeral procession has become a celebration. We don't know what happened immediately after. I like to think that everyone headed back together into Nain to celebrate the miracle that had just happened by having a big feast. Probably with a lot of hummus and pita bread. That's how I imagined it. And grapes. Further along in the same chapter of Luke 7, disciples of John the Baptist come to ask Jesus if he really is the Messiah. In verse 21, it says, "Without answering, Jesus turned to the crowd and healed many of their incurable diseases. His miracle power freed many from their suffering. He restored the gift of sight to the blind, and he drove out demonic spirits from those who were tormented." And then in verse 22, it says, "Only then did Jesus answer the question posed by John's disciples. Now go back and tell John what you have just seen and heard here today. The blind are now seeing. The crippled are now walking. Those who were lepers are now cured. Those who were deaf are now hearing. Those who were dead are now raised back to life. The poor and broken are given the hope of salvation. Jesus came to this earth to restore God's kingdom on earth. And he shows us that God's kingdom isn't about being the most faithful, the most fervent, the most religious. It's about extending a welcome to those who on paper didn't deserve it, didn't seem to deserve it in the first place. He came and saw and asked himself, who are those that need restoration? Who needs me? They belong in my kingdom. Are you poor and broken? Jesus came for you. Are you crippled physically and spiritually? Jesus came for you. Are you on the outside looking in? Jesus came for you. Are you dead spiritually? Jesus came for you to raise you back to life. I could go on with these type of questions. Do you know why Jesus came? He loved you so much that he could not bear to not have you in his kingdom. And that is why Jesus came. Thank you.